Andrew Maughan is the Regional Hydrogeologist for the South Coast. He's involved in groundwater investigation, hydrological monitoring, and provides surface and groundwater management advice to the various DOW program areas and stakeholders. Is that still right?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about a project. We were lucky to get some royalties for regions funding for a project we kicked off in 2012, and it'll wrap up about the middle of next year. And it was an opportunity to do some more investigation around Albany and or focus on Albany and Esperance to learn more about those systems so we can manage them better and also identify future water supplies. And the knowledge from those projects also helps us manage the other groundwater resources in the region, because most of the water, well, all the water supplies pretty much from Albany East to groundwater, and we have a few surface water supplies to the west that we get involved in managing through our the Act that we administer, where we licence abstraction, we do allocation planning, and we can influence how people use water. And so this project, there's a project team with Jahit Yasertner, Cheryl Ryan and Anya Patterson, are the hydrogeologists based in Perth that are involved in the project, and I provide the local regional input to that. So I'll just briefly chat about the different time scales and spatial scales that we work at. So we deal with individual licensees that abstract water, so people, their properties, or the water corporation with their bores. So we deal with them and we give them allocation limits, and we manage them to that, and we review that, they monitor and we review that data, and we can influence their abstraction patterns. And then at a greater sort of at a groundwater area scale, so the Albany groundwater area that Brett mentioned, we do allocation planning. So we do some more investigation to work out how much water is there, and then work out the total amount of water that's available to be allocated, and then we work out the rules for how we do that. And we evaluate that every year. We look at how the resource is going, and we think about what we know and don't know and where we need to do some more investigation. And so this Royalties of the Region project fits in there a bit, and also fits into the longest scale, so the water supply planning, looking at when the supplies are going to be, when our demand curve is going to hit the available supplies we've got, and where we need to find future sources. And that's, I guess here I'm going to talk about today about how we use climate data for this conference. So there's been a few or various climate or rainfall graphs put up. One we like to use is this, which is the cumulative deviation from mean rainfall. So what we look at is look at the mean rain over a long period of time, or at any time scale, but let's say the whole record we've got there for the century and a bit. We look at the mean monthly rainfall, and then we just accumulate whether rainfall in that month is above or below, and by how much, and we just add that up. And that gives us, and that tells us when we've been in wetting phases, more steady phases, and what's important to us is that from the late 60s we've been in a drying phase. And we need to know that, because we need to understand what we know of the resource now, and the response of vegetation and the water levels we measure. So we need to know what the sort of semi-recent climate has been like. And the reason we like to do this is because we know that of the rainfall that we get every year, only in this area maybe about 20% of that will end up as recharge into the groundwater system. And it kind of works pretty well that in any given month, if we get rainfall above the median rainfall, that's enough to overcome the losses from interception by vegetation and transpiration losses, and it'll add to recharge. And if we get rainfall below the median, we don't get recharge, so we'll get declines in groundwater levels because we're getting discharge. So what that means is it works pretty well that the groundwater hydrograph levels should tend to follow that cumulative deviation from the mean rainfall trend, because obviously within a year we'll get, the summer months will be below the median, we'll get groundwater decline, and then when we get recharge we'll get the groundwater rising, so we'll get that variation within the year. But over the longer term, we should get a similar trend. And if the groundwater hydrographs deviate away from that climate trend, that tells us that perhaps the abstraction is having an impact, or there might be other factors like land use having an impact on the groundwater level. So we need to understand that. Now, talk a bit about, so for the future climate scenario, so Artemis and Brett I think mentioned the future climate scenarios that we work with. So in our planning we need to plan for the future, understand what resources are available, what allocations are available to share out amongst groundwater users. And so we're using, as I think Artie mentioned, that we're using the previous, I can't remember the term for it, but the previous generation of climate. So our department did a whole lot of work to work out which of the various climate scenarios to use in our modelling, and for the consultants that put proposals to us to use water will use in their modelling. So we get that. And so if we look out to 2030, for the Albany groundwater area, we're looking at, could be up to about a 10% decline in rainfall. So we need to know that. So obviously some of the scenarios are similar to a slight decline in rainfall up to a much larger decline. So what we're doing now is we've done a heap of investigation through Albany. So we've flown some aerial electromagnetic geophysical survey across the area, and that tells us a bit about the geology and the water quality. So for this, we're going to do some numerical groundwater modelling, and we need to understand about the system, and we need to understand what the values and risks are that we need to manage to. So one of the primary risks, so this is the peninsula, the wind farm's out through here, and these dots are the Water Corporation bores, and then there's a whole lot of private users all through this area here. So one of the primary risks to us is saltwater intrusion, because this is about a sort of 50-metre depth of sediments that contain fresh groundwater that are bounded by seawater and seawater interface, and we need to understand where that is. So if we take a slice through here and we look at some of this AEM data, the airborne electromagnetics, we can interpret that to understand where, so that's seawater, that's the ocean, out off the wind farm there. And we can see from that where the saline groundwater interfaces with the fresh groundwater, and we need to know where that is so that we can site new bores. So the Water Corporation are doing work out here at the moment and looking to drill and establish new bores and pump test those and add them to the supply. So we need to know where the interface is. And but then what we also need to know is whether that's moving over time, because one of the big indicators of whether we're managing the resource sustainably is whether that interface moves inland. So then we have a whole lot of bores along the coast that we monitor regularly to see whether the salinity is increasing or the interface is moving inland. So we have that data. Then in terms of risks and values, vegetation, groundwater dependent vegetation is something we need to manage for. So if vegetation is an area where the depth of groundwater is less than 10 metres, we make an educated guess that vegetation is probably reliant on groundwater. If the water table is quite shallow, say within 0 to 3 metres, that vegetation is probably highly groundwater dependent, and as the depth of groundwater gets greater, that vegetation will probably use groundwater per part of it will be somewhat reliant on groundwater and also obviously soil moisture. So we map where that vegetation is. We make sure we know where all the groundwater users are, because we also need to protect groundwater users from each other. So if some of the big users abstract too much groundwater, that can drop the water level down below the screens of private users, and private users don't have so the Water Corporation can manage and share their draw out, but obviously someone on a property doesn't have that opportunity to shift their abstraction to somewhere else. Next. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're just pulling all this information together to create a groundwater model to predict how what sort of resource we're going to have available into the future. So what we're doing is we've done the Water Corporation have done a heap of drilling through that area, and we're reinterpreting those drill logs and that airborne EM data to understand the geology, and we're principally interested in the different aquifer units, probably more so the intervening clays, so where the aquatards are that separate the deeper groundwater aquifers from the shallow groundwater aquifer and the water table, because it's the water table, the shallow groundwater, that interacts with the vegetation and the other users, and that's more of a critical management issue. So we're revising the geology. We're looking at recharge, so we're getting a better understanding of the zonation of the recharge, and we've done a heap of groundwater chemistry and isotope sampling to understand the rate of the quantity of recharge. So how much of the rainfall ends up as recharge into the system, because that's the primary input into the system. So we need to know the quantity and how that varies across the area. So that and a lot of monitoring through that area, we can understand how changes in the deeper aquifer, say due to pumping, impact on the shallower aquifer, or how rainfall recharge moves from the shallow system down to the deeper system. So we put all that information together into a groundwater model. So we have this revised understanding of the geology, the different layers, and put all that together into a groundwater modelling package. And we're only just starting that. So we're kicking that off on Monday, and that's about a 6-month project for the contractors and us to pull all that information together, run those climate scenarios and the future abstraction scenarios, and understand, we'll make sure we get it right so that we can then adapt our allocation management plans and our licensing decisions to make sure that that we use that resource sustainably and it doesn't impact on the values. So then that we get a better idea of when the water demand projections are going to hit our supply limits, so what we've got available, and then we need to understand what future sources are available. So the other part of the R4R project is looking out in the Albany, what we call the hinterland, and getting a better idea where future sources are. So that AEM data tells us a bit about the geology. Down here, we're principally using it for the saltwater interface understanding and helps us interpolate between boreholes of what the geology is. But out in the hinterland here, this is just one depth slice through that data. But really we're looking for paleo channels, so old ancient river drainages that have since filled with these Eocene sediments that are the same that we get down here, so it's marine and estuarine sediments. And so wherever the basement topography is deep enough, we should get these sediments, and where they're well enough connected and they have an outlet, they'll have reasonable supplies of good fresh water. So then I'd look for likely areas that are worth drilling, and then we went out late last year and drilled a whole lot of investigation boreholes where we drilled down to basement bedrock, so generally between about 80 to 120 metres, and assess the lithology for grain size and the properties, so the sands and silts and sandstones, siltstones and clays in those areas, and pump test, get an idea of what sort of yields we can get out of those bores and the quality of the data, and then run geophysical logs down the boreholes that then we sort of use to ground truth the airborne geophysical data, and then from that we can map prospective areas for future further investigation. And that's actually it. So that's a quick snapshot of the R4R project. We're about 6 to 8 months away from the end of it, and then we'll have the findings from that a few of us and some of our stakeholders are eagerly awaiting. Thank you.